By the autumn of 1944, the war in Europe had become a nightmare for American tank crews. The early optimism that followed the landings in Normandy had evaporated, replaced by fear, exhaustion, and a growing sense of vulnerability. The M4 Sherman, once praised as dependable and unstoppable, now felt painfully inadequate against Germany's heavy armor. Every stretch of road, every field beyond a hedgerow, and every distant tree line felt like a potential death trap. American tankers lived with the constant knowledge that a single enemy shell could turn their vehicle into a burning coffin. Letters sent home often tried to sound brave, but the reality was darker. Crews were no longer asking for glory or medals. They were asking for protection. They wanted a tank that could survive a direct hit, a tank that could face German armor without immediately sacrificing lives. Rumors began to circulate about a new American heavy tank, larger and more powerful than the Sherman. It was said to have thick armor and a gun capable of killing German Panthers from the front. Its name was the M26 Pershing. For the men fighting at the front, it felt like hope had finally arrived, even if only in whispers. The fear gripping American tank crews was not imagined or exaggerated. The German Panther tank was one of the most formidable weapons on the battlefield. Designed with thick sloped frontal armor, it could easily deflect most Sherman shells fired from the front. Meanwhile, its long-barreled, high-velocity gun could destroy an American tank from extreme distances. Often, Sherman crews were hit before they even realized where the enemy was hiding. The imbalance was terrifying. The Sherman gained grim nicknames among its crews, the most infamous being the Ronson, a reference to how easily it was believed to catch fire after being penetrated. While later historians would argue that Sherman tanks did not burn more frequently than other tanks, perception mattered more than statistics. To a man trapped inside thin armor, fear was absolute. When American forces pushed beyond the protective hedgerows of Normandy into the open countryside of France, the situation worsened. Engagement distances increased, and German tanks thrived in long-range combat. The battlefield increasingly favored Panthers and Tigers, turning every advance into a test of nerves and luck. As the fighting moved eastward, American tankers learned that survival depended on numbers, coordination, and sacrifice. Frontal engagements against German tanks were often suicidal. Instead, crews relied on flanking maneuvers, artillery support, air power, and sheer numerical advantage. Even then, victory came at a terrible price. It was not uncommon for multiple Shermans to be lost in order to destroy a single German tank. Each burning wreck represented a crew that might never return home. This reality crushed morale. Tankers began to feel like expendable assets rather than valued soldiers. They knew they were brave, but bravery alone could not stop armor-piercing shells. For these men, the M26 Pershing became a symbol of fairness. It promised a chance to fight on equal terms, to meet a Panther head-on and survive. The desire for the Pershing was not about pride or ego. It was about staying alive long enough to see the war end. Far from the smoke and chaos of the battlefield, General George S. Patton saw the situation through a completely different lens. When the Pershing was proposed as a replacement for the Sherman, Patton reacted with open resistance. He did not want it. He opposed any move that would slow Sherman production. To many observers, this stance seemed heartless, even reckless. How could a commander known for his aggressive use of tanks reject a weapon that could clearly save lives? But Patton was not blind to the suffering of his men. He simply believed that he was fighting a different war. His responsibility was not limited to individual tank duels. His responsibility was to win the entire campaign. His battlefield was not the few hundred yards in front of a tank's gun. It was the entire map of Western Europe. To Patton, slowing down for heavier armor meant giving the enemy time, and time was the most dangerous weapon of all. Patton's philosophy of warfare was shaped long before World War II. He was a cavalry officer at heart, raised on the belief that speed and aggression decided wars. To him, tanks were not meant to sit and trade blows like medieval knights. They were modern horses, designed to move fast, break through enemy lines, and spread chaos in the rear. His famous doctrine was simple: pin the enemy in place, then strike where they are weakest. Infantry and artillery would hold the enemy's attention, while armored divisions would race through gaps, capturing supply depots, cutting communication lines, and surrounding entire enemy formations. This kind of warfare demanded mobility above all else. A slow, heavy tank that required careful planning and constant support did not fit Patton's vision. He needed tanks that could move day and night, across long distances, without stopping. The Sherman, despite its flaws, perfectly matched Patton's needs. It was reliable. It was easy to maintain. It could travel long distances without catastrophic mechanical failure. Patton especially trusted the M4A3 variant with its Ford V8 engine, which proved durable under harsh conditions. German tanks, by contrast, were engineering marvels but mechanical disasters. Panthers suffered frequent transmission failures. Tigers consumed massive amounts of fuel and required constant maintenance. Many German tanks were abandoned by their crews not because they were destroyed, but because they could no longer move. Patton understood a brutal truth: a tank that cannot move is worse than a destroyed one. It blocks roads, slows advances, and becomes a liability. A Sherman that kept running could still contribute to victory, even if it was individually weaker. Speed was Patton's obsession. He believed momentum saved lives. The faster his army moved, the less time the enemy had to regroup, dig in, or counterattack. The Sherman allowed him to maintain this relentless pace. It could move quickly on roads, keeping pressure on retreating German forces. Its relatively light weight meant it could cross most European bridges without delay, avoiding bottlenecks that could stall an entire army. Every river crossed without stopping was a victory in itself. Heavy tanks like the Pershing threatened this speed. They required stronger bridges, more planning, and more fuel. To Patton, these delays were unacceptable. He believed that hesitation was deadly. Numbers also mattered deeply to Patton. The United States was fighting an industrial war, and Patton embraced that reality without apology. America could build tanks faster than Germany could destroy them. Nearly 50,000 Shermans rolled off assembly lines during the war, creating an armored force that could absorb losses and keep advancing. The Pershing endangered this system. It was heavier, more complex, and slower to produce. Switching production late in the war would reduce the number of tanks reaching the front. For a commander who was constantly demanding more fuel, more ammunition, and more vehicles, this was unacceptable. Fewer tanks meant slower advances. Slower advances meant stronger German resistance. From a logistical perspective, the Pershing was deeply troubling. Its weight strained transport vehicles and bridges. It consumed more fuel at a time when fuel shortages already threatened to halt Patton's advance. Supply lines were stretched thin across France, and every extra gallon mattered. Worse still, the Pershing was untested in large-scale combat. New tanks brought new problems, and Patton had no patience for experimentation during an active campaign. He preferred the known limitations of the Sherman to the unknown failures of a new machine. Reliability, not perfection, was his priority. Yet, despite all of Patton's strategic logic, the voices of the tank crews cannot be ignored, because they were fighting a very different kind of war. Their battlefield was not the map of Europe. It was the narrow field of vision through a gun's sight, the shaking steel walls around them, and the seconds between firing and being hit. For these men, every encounter was deeply personal. When a German Panther appeared, there was no comfort in knowing that supply lines were being cut somewhere far behind the front. In that moment, armor thickness, gun power, and survival were the only things that mattered. The Sherman's thin armor meant that even experienced crews felt exposed and vulnerable. Fear was constant, but it was a fear learned through experience, through watching friends burn inside their tanks. For them, the M26 Pershing was not just a new vehicle. It was the promise of fairness. It meant a chance to meet the enemy head-on without immediately being outmatched. It meant fewer funerals, fewer burned wrecks, and fewer letters written to families back home explaining why a son or husband would never return. Their desire for the Pershing was not about pride or complaining. It was about the most basic human instinct in war, the desire to survive long enough to see peace. The uncomfortable and often painful truth is that both sides of this argument were right, because they were measuring success in different ways. Patton was right about how wars are won. Campaigns are decided by movement, pressure, and the collapse of the enemy's ability to fight. In that sense, the Sherman was a powerful tool. It allowed American forces to move faster than the Germans could react. It kept momentum alive when pauses could have been deadly. At the same time, tank crews were right about how battles are survived. A battle is won one moment at a time, one decision at a time, and one exchange of fire at a time. For that reality, the Pershing was clearly superior. When Pershing tanks finally reached the battlefield in early 1945, they proved exactly what crews had hoped for. They could destroy German Panthers and Tigers from the front. They could absorb hits that would have destroyed a Sherman. Lives were saved. Confidence returned. But history is cruelly ironic. The Pershing arrived when the war was already nearing its end. Germany was collapsing under pressure from all sides. The heavy tank that could have changed the emotional experience of the war arrived too late to change its outcome. The debate between the Sherman and the Pershing is not really about tanks. It is about the nature of war itself. It is about the constant tension between strategy and humanity, between what wins wars and what saves lives in the moment. The Sherman was not the most powerful tank of World War II, and no serious historian would claim that it was. But it was reliable, fast, and available in overwhelming numbers, and those qualities helped carry the American army across Europe at breathtaking speed. Patton understood that perfection can slow an army, while momentum can break an enemy. He chose speed over protection, reliability over power, and movement over comfort. It was a cold and controversial choice, and it came at a terrible human cost. Yet it helped bring the war to an end sooner than it might have otherwise lasted. In the end, George Patton did not choose the Sherman because it was the safest option. He chose it because he believed it was the fastest way to finish the war. And in war, finishing the fight is often the only mercy commanders believe they can offer.